Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's May 13th, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. First topic is a retrospective on the COVID pandemic, specifically the Pfizer shot. Going back about 5 years ago, 2021, is when the initial push, the initial rollout of the COVID shots was being ramped up and up. The coercion was increasingly intense, and the first few months it was the authorities, the establishment was optimistic that they wouldn't have to implement coercive measures, that they could instigate or implement the largest propaganda campaign of all time and convince people to take the shot voluntarily. But as the rates remained stubbornly low, more coercive measures were implemented. So I wanted to look back in retrospect and see how many of the claims that were being made about the efficacy of the shot, I'm going to focus specifically on the Pfizer shot, how many of the claims that were being made in early 2021 were accurate.
I haven't looked at the information Jeff is about to provide. I don't know what the denominator will be because I don't know how many things he's going to evaluate, but I will go ahead and venture a guess that the numerator, the number on top, will be 0. So it'll be 0 out of X claims turned out to be accurate.
The top line figure that was thrown around was the COVID shot was 95% effective. And I honestly think that that was the extent of most people's quote unquote understanding of the efficacy of the shot. If you had asked them what that means by what the 95% effective means, they would probably say that 95%, that if you get the shot, there's a 95% chance that you'll be completely protected from COVID.
Which, if accurate, and I suspect that's a pretty good characterization of it, would be on its face absurd given the fact that the flu vaccine that is offered on an annual basis has an efficacy rate of about 50%. So something that had no time to develop, was rushed, and was putatively existing to combat a novel disease that there was no institutional knowledge of, or at least nothing like the long history and the repetitions that existed for the flu vaccine, that it would be 95% effective when the flu vaccine is just 50% effective should have set alarm bells off if anyone were paying attention or had any desire to really try to get to the bottom of where those claims were coming from.
So let's dig into that 95% figure. What it actually refers to is in the Pfizer clinical trials for the COVID shot, they had 43,500 people, and they split that group half and half between a control group and a placebo group, meaning half of the 43,500 people got the COVID shot, half of them got a placebo, and then they compared the results. So 8 vaccinated participants developed symptomatic COVID compared to 162 in the placebo group. So in absolute terms, the COVID shot improved your chances of not getting symptomatic COVID from about 99.26 to about 99.96. So if you didn't get the shot, you were about 99.26% likely not to get COVID at all. And then if you got the shot, your chances of not getting COVID went up from 99.26 to 99.96, so less than 1 percentage point. The 95% figure comes from comparing those two groups. So comparing 8 to 162, the difference between the groups is 95%.
Granting that that trial was legitimately executed, that is not so far removed from mandating something like a rubber suit for people who live in places where there are a lot of thunderstorms, and saying that wearing the rubber suit reduces your chance of dying from a lightning strike by 95%. The take-home point that Jeff was making there was that getting this shot was not something that the vast majority of people needed to do, because virtually no one was going to get COVID in the first place. And so it protected against something, allegedly, again, granting that the findings from the Pfizer study are legitimate. There obviously could not have been any study of what the potential negative effects, particularly the long-term negative ramifications of getting the shot were. But even if we grant that the short-term benefits were as the Pfizer study would lead us to believe, that does not at all provide evidence as to why the vast majority of people should get the shot, in the same way that the vast majority of people shouldn't wear a rubber suit in the Midwest in the spring, even if it does drastically reduce the chance that they'll die from a lightning strike if they get struck by lightning, because so few people are going to get struck by lightning. And there are, of course, a lot of obvious negative externalities, negative consequences from wearing a rubber suit, walking around, waddling around in a rubber suit just to protect yourself from something that is vanishingly unlikely to harm you. And so the analogy holds with the COVID shot, given the subsequent knowledge about the negative ramifications of receiving the shot compared to the very minimal benefits of getting it.
So what is symptomatic COVID-19? In the Pfizer trial, quote, confirmed case of symptomatic COVID-19 required a participant to report at least one of a specific list of symptoms, such as fever, new or increased cough, new or increased shortness of breath, chills, new or increased muscle pain, sore throat, diarrhea, vomiting, or new loss of taste or smell. And then they had to test positive on a PCR test. And so that 95% figure is the relative risk reduction. The absolute risk reduction was less than 1%. And based on my research, it was pretty well established and understood among serious scientists before 2020, before the COVID pandemic, that absolute risk reduction was a much more important metric. It is much more relevant to an individual who's supposed to have informed consent whenever they undergo a medical intervention, including taking a shot. The absolute risk reduction is much more important. So by that logic, which again was pretty well established before COVID, the number that people should have been given was the COVID shot will reduce your risk of becoming really sick from COVID by about 0.5 percentage point. And even that number, when, as Ness was alluding to, is misleading, because the risk that individuals had from COVID was drastically different based on your age and health. And so if you were a healthy 20, 30, 40, even 50-year-old person with no major health issues and lived a relatively healthy lifestyle, your absolute risk reduction from the COVID shot was probably even less than that, even less than 0.5%. But to be fair, on the other end, if you're old and sick, your absolute risk reduction was probably higher than 0.5%. But all of that nuance was completely lost during COVID. Everything was simplified, dumbed down, obfuscated, where the 95% figure became the only thing you needed to know, and you were ridiculous if you wanted to do your own research like I'm doing. And it was all just 95% effective. Everybody has to get this shot. If you don't get the shot, not only are you putting yourself in danger, but you're endangering everyone else. When I started the podcast by saying in retrospect, even that is not exactly accurate, because this information was known at the time. To be fair to Pfizer, it was buried in the report that it put out. All of this information was available. And of course, the corporate media just led with the 95%. They had seemingly no curiosity, or maybe they knew better and they had their marching orders from Pfizer, who, of course, is a major sponsor of corporate media. but that information was available and could have been disseminated. So all of the major outlets ran the 95% number uncritically. NBC News reported that the Pfizer shot was, quote, more than 90% effective at preventing infection. The Washington Post had the same figure. Scientific American led with the 90% figure. And again, in the press releases from Pfizer, this data that I'm going over was available at the time. It had the 8 cases out of the 22,000 and the 162 out of the other 122,000. But no major newsroom that I'm aware of presented the numbers in that way. That is the accurate way. And again, the Pfizer clinical tests were not designed to measure whether vaccinated people could still contract the virus asymptomatically or whether they could transmit it to others. And when the FDA announced the emergency use authorization for the COVID shot on December 11, 2020, the announcement stated that there was no evidence that the vaccine prevented person-to-person transmission. And that didn't stop President Joe Biden, for instance, in July of 2021 from saying, quote, "You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations." And he said that vaccinated people would not be hospitalized, wouldn't end up in the ICU, and would not die. And to be fair, Snopes confirmed that these statements from Biden were false, and Newsweek also confirmed them to be misinformation. On March 29, 2021, the CDC director Rochelle Walensky was on the Rachel Maddow show and stated, "Our data from the CDC today suggests that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick, and that it's not just in the clinical trials, but it's also in real-world data." Lie, lie, lie.
And before we leave it in the dust as we go through other lies, don't let it go unremarked on that the claim that there was a necessity for everyone to be fully vaccinated to stop the spread, that is a very odd way to sell a vaccine, to insinuate that you don't need to get it to protect yourself as much as you need to get it to protect others. But if the vaccine makes it so you're protected, then what do you have to worry about whether or not other people get the vaccine? Unless it is just out of the magnanimity of your Puritan heart that you want to force other people to take care of themselves better than you think that they're taking care of themselves at the time. But what the Pfizer study showed and what it claimed, or what it didn't claim, was that there was any evidence at all that becoming vaccinated would reduce the transmission or the ability to pass on with as an asymptomatic carrier.
Funny you should mention the Puritans, because I was reminded of the Scarlet Letter, where the unvaccinated were treated in a similar way that the citizens of Boston treated Hester Prynne with the Scarlet Letter. The mask was sort of a reverse Scarlet Letter. It was a way to show that you were pure, that you were untainted by sin.
Yes, the comparison is good as far as it goes, and there are very much echoes of Albion Seed and the different folkways of American traditions in terms of what places in the country were most enthusiastic about getting the vaccine and pushing it on everyone else, and that was the Northeast, the Puritans, the New Englanders. They were the most ardent supporters and pushers of the vaccines, and the greatest resistance were the Scots, Irish, Appalachian, and Southern state Americans. That said, I wouldn't want to disparage the 17th century Puritans too hard by comparing them to the 2021 COVIDians.
I'm going to play a compilation of some corporate media excerpts, news excerpts. This is primarily doctors and officials, government officials, and news anchors and personalities.
The virus stops with every vaccinated person.
Do it so you stop spreading this terrible disease.
And that vaccine, key goal is to stop the transmission so that you get almost no infection going on whatsoever.
Expectation for vaccines is not to get infected.
A vaccinated person gets exposed to the virus does not infect them.
When the virus gets to you, you stop it.
You're not going to catch it, you're not going to get sick, you're not going to transmit it.
The vaccine is absolutely bulletproof.
Vaccines block you from getting and giving the virus.
100% effective at preventing COVID.
A vaccine prevents you from getting infected.
It is to keep you from getting it and then spreading it.
We have the ability to stop COVID in its tracks.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
Biden tests positive for COVID-19.
When people are vaccinated, they can feel safe that they are not going to get infected.
Dr. Fauci tests positive for COVID-19.
Vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick.
The CDC director tests positive for COVID-19.
Yeah.
That was a representative sample of what was being blasted, disseminated across America. Lie after lie after lie. Misinformation, disinformation. That 95% figure, as we pointed out, which is very misleading, it is a relative risk reduction of 95%. Absolute risk reduction, as we said, is less than 1%. But even that 95% fell to 84% by 6 months later, and then was falling about 6 percentage points every 2 months. And then in October 2021, there was actually a Pfizer-funded study published in The Lancet that found that the real-world effectiveness against infection had dropped from 88% in the first full month after full vaccination to 47% at 6 months. And then as new variants came out, the shot was found to be only 53% effective against the Delta variant. And so looking at the timeline, jumping ahead a little bit, but the federal government started implementing vaccine mandates for employers in late 2021. And the 95% figure was continued to be touted and undergirded the policy justification for the vaccine mandates requiring people to get the vaccine or lose their job. But even the declining effectiveness, such as it is almost beside the point, because the supposed justification for the mandates were preventing transmission. Not only did the shot not prevent transmission, they didn't even test whether it did prevent transmission, despite what all those people in the clip we just played were saying. And some of those people included Dr. Anthony Fauci, who told people that if they got the shot, they would not get infected by COVID. So in the decade preceding COVID, the average or the median clinical development period for FDA approved vaccines, so that's from what's called phase 1 to full approval, the median time was about just over 8 years. The Pfizer shot was under clinical development for 6 months before submitting its emergency use authorization application. And the FDA's own guidance for full vaccine approval recommend that clinical trials continue for 1 to 2 years. However, the EUA, the emergency use authorization guidance, required only a medium follow-up of 2 months. And keep in mind, notice I've been trying not to use the word vaccine, because that, by any widely understood understanding of the definition of vaccine, the COVID shot does not qualify. The first messenger RNA vaccine tested in humans targeted rabies, and enrollment for those tests began in October 2013. And so prior to COVID-19, no mRNA quote-unquote vaccine had ever been approved for mass human deployment. As if there weren't already enough issues with this Pfizer clinical trial, in early 2021, Pfizer and Moderna, in their own tests as well, they offered placebo participants the option to become unblinded and receive the vaccine. And so, as you recall, the Pfizer placebo group and the vaccinated group, they both had around 22,000 people. And so the trial was originally designed to run through 2022 to assess long-term safety and durability of efficacy, as that is very standard clinical testing. When you're testing the efficacy of a given drug, you have a control group and a placebo group. And obviously, the test only works if that placebo group remains a placebo group. But in the case of this Pfizer shot vaccine, 93% of the original placebo recipients by March 13th had already received at least one dose of the vaccine. So the placebo group was essentially vaccinated completely, and so long-term safety data was lost. Returning to this video compilation, here are some, again, corporate media figures and doctors and politicians expressing rage at the temerity of people who chose not to get the Pfizer shot. That, again, keep in mind, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but I feel like it's important to emphasize. Not only did the Pfizer shot not stop transmission, the Pfizer shot did not prevent you from being infected with the shot. It did not prevent you from transmitting. They didn't even test whether it stopped transmission.
We are not the problem. The problem are the unvaccinated.
The unvaccinated threat.
Unvaccinated people are a threat, a direct threat.
The threat to all of us.
The unvaccinated are a risk to all of us.
People have a right to be protected from the unvaccinated.
Maybe there should be laws that allow them to be kept out of the building.
So at least, thankfully, they're not breathing the same air. Their freedom to breathe will diminish. Start firing the unvaccinated.
If you don't vaccinate, you'll be fired.
Time to come down on the unvaccinated.
They should be banned from the VA, banned from restaurants, banned from other businesses and colleges.
Companies should not treat us as equals.
Place unvaccinated people under arrest.
It's the unvaccinated that has put America in the place that it is.
We are losing freedom because people are unvaccinated.
Anger towards the unvaccinated. I'm furious at the unvaccinated.
Frustrated with Americans still not vaccinated.
Not to be vaccinated seems criminal.
Suspects face years behind bars for coughing on police officers.
Freedom.
For them charged with terrorist threats.
You have no individual rights when it comes to the vaccine.
Really, you're killing other people.
We're being attacked by unvaccinated.
The unvaccinated who aren't wearing masks. It's the unvaccinated who aren't social distancing. It's the unvaccinated going to crowded indoor events.
It is not your right as an American citizen to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection.
So screw your freedom. We can coerce you.
You're not going to be able to travel to see your family.
If someone in your family isn't vaccinated, should you ask them not to show up?
Yes, you really shouldn't have anyone unvaccinated come to dinner. That's just a huge risk.
If you want to come out into public, if you want to live your life, you need to get the vaccination.
It's time for people to see vaccination as literally necessary.
You should have to show that you're vaccinated in order to go places.
Unvaccinated tennis player can't travel to the U.S.
If you're not vaccinated, you're not welcome.
Our patience is wearing thin.
So how do those raging maniacs feel about we purebloods today, those of them who are still alive, that is? It could be a consequence of my personal perspective, given the absolute refusal to allow myself to be injected with any variation of the so-called COVID vaccine, but it is not difficult to detect in that rage, in that hysteria, a sense that these are people who feel like maybe they are on some sort of sinking ship and they want everyone else to have to climb aboard too, and that the rage really is a residual belief that maybe those who resisted the shot were in the right, and that the specter of long-term damage from the vaccine and the subsequent rise in cancer rates and myocarditis and other attendant effects from vaccine damage, the VAERS rate going up, Jeff talking about the alleged protection that the Pfizer vaccine offered, that 95% protection. Well, if we look at the rate of vaccine injuries in the VAERS reporting system from 2020 to 2022, it had increased literally more than an order of magnitude, so like over 1,000%. While I'm criticizing these people, I do have the mote and beam in the eye problem that I would be remiss if I didn't articulate here. The newest iteration of the potential COVID scares, the hantavirus, and I can't shake the observation in a very game theory, EV-oriented mind that if I were the powers that be and I wanted to realize the ends that all of these people in the compilation we just played shouting at the unvaccinated, if I really had the ability to release or manufacture a deadly virus, and I had the inoculation against it. Well, given the groundwork that has been laid from COVID, having another scare, something like a repeat of COVID, except this time it's real, and this time the shot really does offer protection. Well, the people who were going to remain as loyal recipients of the new vaccine, even the more skeptical types, or the people who went along to get along, who got the COVID shot but have subsequently had misgivings about it and regret having done so, if those people, along with the people who were skeptical from the beginning, refuse to get the shot to some new virus that actually is threatening, well, that would be the perfect thing for the powers that be, because say 20% of the population gets it. Well, that's going to be the most compliant, status-oriented, subservient to the globo homo managerial state will be the ones who get the shot, and then the rest of the population, well, if bad things happen to them, there could be no outcome the Bill Gates types would like more than that. That should not at all be construed as counsel to fall hook, line, and sinker for whatever scary alleged pandemic comes down the pike. I will likely be as incredulous, or even more so than I was during COVID, for whatever the next iteration turns out to be. If the hantavirus looks like it has legs and it is able to stay in the news cycle top of mind for months or even years into the future, and I don't have any other response to offer, nor would I suggest any other response other than the extreme skepticism that Jeff and I wish more people exhibited during COVID in future iterations. But this is to at least acknowledge a potential point of weakness in my own position and my own orientation towards these things.
Talking about the effectiveness or efficacy of the COVID shot, we talked about the absolute risk reduction, which is the more relevant, important number, being a reduction of less than 1%. That's only kind of half the question. The other, because if you look at that in isolation, you could say, well, okay, maybe it's an extremely minimal efficacy rate, but why not just get it? It's better than nothing. Well, that's assuming that there are no negative side effects to the shot, and that is absolutely not the case. And of course, that was why all during COVID, in 2021, 2022, when the coercion effort was at its high point, that's why any talk of negative effects of the shot were mocked and censored. And even, I know anecdotally, people who personally got the shot and had heart issues and myocarditis, people were the COVID people, when they were told about people having negative effects, they were incredulous, and I guess just thought that those people were making it up, that they had any sort of myocarditis. But as Ness mentioned, the VAERS system, that's the VAERS, or Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. It found that myocarditis reports linked to COVID-19 vaccines in 2021 far exceeded reports from all other vaccines combined over the previous 3 decades. And cases were occurring predominantly in young males. And again, that was the population that least needed the vaccine, especially if you were young, male, and healthy. The risk from the vaccine far exceeded the benefit that you got from it. And it really is symptomatic, used in a different sense of that word, symptomatic of something sick in our society, that traditionally the elderly were the ones who were supposed to sacrifice for the well-being of their offspring. And America's supposed to be about the parents sacrificing so that their children can lead better lives. In the case of COVID, it was the children, the young people were meant were expected to sacrifice for the benefit of the elderly.
Yes, the young and the working classes had to turn their lives upside down for the putative protection of retirees. But apropos what we discussed last week, there was no drop in support for continuing to fund things like Social Security and Medicare, which take resources from those younger people and give it to the wealthy retirees. So I think this is one and the same in terms of the societal orientation of the 21st century American polity.
Although you also we talked about the rising rates of assisted suicide, and you could argue that that is actually somewhat sacrificing the elderly for the benefit of the young, because the reality is a lot of times the people in those assisted suicide situations, their life with great cost and resources expended, their life can be extended for maybe a few months, maybe a few years at most, and the quality of the life is going to be pretty low. Whereas in the alternative, they could just die voluntarily, saving a lot of money and resources that could be used by younger, healthier people.
I predict that 5 or 10 years down the line, that statement, while understandable now, is going to look in retrospect quite naive when the second or third leading cause of death for men between the ages of 15 and say 45 or 50 is voluntary suicide. I don't think, given that most of that medical assistance in dying now is overwhelmingly skewed older, that as it becomes more widespread and more accepted, that it is going to stay contained predominantly among the most elderly. I think it is going to worm its way into the rest of society and be normalized and be a much more significant cause of loss in years lived for the younger cohorts, the younger members of the population, even though in absolute numbers, yes, probably the elderly will receive assisted suicide more in terms of the expected years of living. In total, I think that number will be more greatly reduced among younger generations in the future and in a not so distant future.
It's hard to get good data. The best I could come up with was that the mRNA vaccines showed an excess risk of serious adverse events of about 10.1 per 10,000 for Pfizer. If that number is accurate, then this excess risk surpassed the risk reduction for COVID-19 hospitalizations. So that is worth repeating. The best data I could find was that essentially the risk from the vaccine was greater than the putative risk reduction for at least COVID-19 hospitalization. And I believe that is overall population. So that is skewed even more. It is, I would say, I feel comfortable saying beyond a reasonable doubt, the risk for anybody relatively healthy under the age of 50, the risk of the COVID shot exceeded any benefit given by the shot.
It is virtually guaranteed that negative consequence of the shot, the adverse reactions to the shots, that those figures are underreported because there are going to be a not insignificant percentage of people who have regret about having received the shock, private regret, but do not want to take the ego hit or have to swallow their pride by admitting that they were wrong and what they did ended up having negative consequences. That is to say, emphatically, I concur with Jeff's assessment.
One other thing I want to briefly touch on, there were about 153 individual clinical sites where these Pfizer trials occurred. And at least 3 of them had significant issues with how the trials were conducted. So a lot of this is assuming that the data is can even be trusted to begin with. There's at least some reason to believe that the underlying data itself is flawed, and it would stands to reason that if the numbers themselves were suspect, the real numbers would be less advantageous to the vaccine, to the efficacy of, to the narrative that the vaccine is safe. Because at every level, every person carrying out the clinical trials had an incentive for the COVID shot to be shown to be effective. Even the placebo group, as shown by the fact that as soon as they were able to take the COVID shot, 90 to 95% of them took that opportunity. And clearly anybody working at Pfizer, anybody at these contracted sites who carried out the clinical tests, all the employees who are products of the medical educational system, everybody involved, that basically every single level, if they were going to fudge the numbers, they would almost certainly fudge the numbers to make the shot look better. And so at least 3 of these clinical sites, there was a whistleblower who raised serious issues. I'm not going to go into the details, but the company is called Vintavia. So to wrap it up, the public was given one number, 95%, which was stripped of all context. The absolute risk reduction, which again is the much more important number, was a fraction of a percent. The trial did not measure transmission, even as the mandates were justified on the basis of protecting others. This mRNA technology had never been deployed at anywhere near the scale that it was beginning in late 2020, early 2021. The follow-up period was a fraction of what was normally required. The control group was offered the vaccine within months, so it made long-term comparative safety data impossible. The efficacy against infection declined below 50% within 6 months, even as that original 95% number was cited. Myocarditis wasn't detected until after the vaccines were mass deployed. There were significant issues at some of the trial sites. Earlier, we discussed the problematic nature of even using the term vaccine. And actually, prior to 2021, the Center for Disease Control's official definition of, quote, vaccine described it as a product that produces immunity, meaning it prevents infection. But in September 2021, and again, this is at the height of the vaccine rollout and the beginning of the really nasty draconian mandates of the vaccine. So in September 2021, the CDC quietly updated the definition of a vaccine to describe it as a product that produces protection rather than immunity. And other sources made the change too. Merriam-Webster also made a similar update to its definition of vaccine during that same period. And no surprise that there wasn't any formal public announcement. This was just done quietly, and it's almost impossible to believe that this was done for any other reason than to retcon the COVID shot, which was not a vaccine by any traditional definition of that word, to retroactively make it fit the definition of a vaccine. We reference George Orwell a lot here at the Reality Taboo. I can't help but think of Winston Smith in 1984 at the Ministry of Truth being forced to rewrite historical records to match whatever the capital P party claimed.
But while the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine failed to live up to any single one of the oft-changing claims of what it could do, what did happen to Pfizer, which surely by pure coincidence, is the most held stock symbol among members of Congress. At least that was the case as of, I believe, 2023 or 2024. Probably not anymore, given what has happened to that stock in the intervening 5 years since the COVID insanity was at its max. But in February of 2020, prior to the scare of COVID and the shutdown that would transpire in March of 2020, the following month, in February of 2020, Pfizer was trading at $35 a share. And then in December of 2021, when the Biden administration was pushing hard from the executive to force employer mandates, that was just a couple months before the Supreme Court shut down OSHA and neutered the attempts to force private companies to mandate shots. In December of 2021, Pfizer stock reached almost $60 a share. And keep in mind, that's a near doubling in just 18 months, which is a pretty good return for a major established company. But it is far more remarkable when put in the context of what was happening to the rest of the economy and the rest of the market during that period of time. So when there were tens of millions of people unemployed and huge decreases in stock portfolios, Pfizer was doubling its market value, and a lot of people in the know who had the ability to mandate or nearly mandate Pfizer vaccines were becoming fantastically rich as the vast majority of the population was suffering both physically and psychologically and financially.
There's a reason that COVID is often described as the largest upward transfer of wealth in history.
Yes, that reason is that it was exactly that.
It's remarkable to me how little curiosity Americans I interact with seem to have about COVID. It is clearly, in my mind, one of the top 5 most consequential world events of my lifetime, at least the last 30 years. I would put it up there with, if we want to go back a few years into the late 80s, the breakup of the Soviet Union, 9/11, and the resulting war on terror, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, and then COVID. I think it belongs in the same category as those events in terms of significance. And yet we're only a few years removed from COVID. And in some ways, it's like it never happened. I can't help but notice the people, though, who are most reluctant to discuss it were also the most hardcore COVIDians. And I guess if I wanted to be maybe a little uncharitable, although I would characterize it as realistic and accurate, is that the gravity of how wrong those people were about something so important, and not only how wrong they were, but how self-righteously they proclaim themselves to be following the science and to be correct, and how comfortable they were in shunning and making people who refused to comply to make their lives miserable, how comfortable they were doing all that. And it could just be as simple as they maybe won't admit that they were wrong, but at some level they know they were wrong and they just don't want to talk about it because it reflects very poorly on them in so many ways.
I think you're giving them too much credit in general. I think that most people, and this is increasing, it seems like we're approaching an escape velocity when it comes to attention spans and the perpetual need for novelty, for always focusing on what is in the present and what is in the immediate future. And I would be heartened if in a certain way, I'd be heartened if most of the most ardent COVIDians had privately reflected and gone through introspection and realized that they were wrong and they needed to keep their mouths shut about it now to hope that people would forget about it, because that would presume that they would have learned something and that there would have been some systematic change in the social conformity and the status associated with something like COVID that is pushed from the top down onto the rest of the masses. And there is a bunch of status associated with trusting the managerial state, which in this case manifests as trusting the science, that if they had really reflected on that, then there would be some potential change in the future. But I think it's a lot shallower than that. I think the reason that it isn't talked about by most people is because most people simply aren't interested in what happened last week, let alone what happened half a decade ago. Jeff mentioned 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so using that same frame of reference, although the situation has deteriorated significantly in 25 years in terms of attention spans going down with the need for novelty and perpetual stimulus correspondingly going up, that here we are in the midst of an Iran war that was supposed to last for a matter of days and then a matter of weeks. And now here we are months in and it continues to rage on. And yet so many of the lessons that could have been learned from Iraq or Afghanistan, were people so inclined to learn those lessons, seem not to be applied in any meaningful way with the Iran conflict now. In fact, the opposition 20 years ago was a lot stronger. The lessons had been learned from Vietnam, perhaps. And though tensions were compared to the 1970s by the early 2000s, attention spans had been reduced and the need for stimulus had increased. That has only grown at an increasing rate in the subsequent 20 years since the Iraq War. And of course, the Iraq invasion and what's going on with Iran, at least at this point, are not exactly the same. The take-home point I'm trying to make here is that there is, in general, just less interest in the past and less ability to sustain positions in the present based on things that have happened in the past. And I think that is a direct consequence of the fact that, at least in the developed world, and really throughout even the developing and third world, that the vast majority of people are staring into an electronic gourd that is feeding them perpetual new information. And we're entering now a world where that too is growing exponentially. The amount of data through AI slop that people will be able to consume indefinitely. The idea that there is going to be just even the idea, I am myself somewhat susceptible to it, because the topic that we're bringing up here, I am inherently thinking, as this was Jeff's idea, as we're talking about it, I'm thinking to the extent that we appeal to a public that this COVID, and I was as rigorous an opponent of COVIDianism as anyone else, save baby Jeff, we were probably equally opposed to it. And yet even I feel myself thinking this is kind of a boring, passe, old topic that isn't going to interest people because they're really hardly going to remember it. Maybe it'll almost feel nostalgic, like a trip down memory lane, and it might have some appeal in that regard. But even I am susceptible to the very thing that I am criticizing more broadly. Parenthetically, though, the focus of what we've talked about here has been the vaccine, so-called, and the Pfizer-led response to the COVID pandemic. in a soul-crushing HR-mandated training module I had to go through this week, it was mentioned that it is safest to use a fire extinguisher to put out a fire that is 6 feet away from the person who is using the fire extinguisher. That you're not supposed to get any closer and you're not supposed to be any farther away. You're supposed to be 6 feet to attack a fire with a fire extinguisher. And the advice that was pushed by the medical establishment as COVID heated up in March of 2020 and April of 2020 was to maintain 6 feet of social distancing to stop the spread. And then subsequently it would be admitted by Fauci that that number just sounded right. And he basically pulled it out of his backside. And so I am trying to give him a little more credit here. I don't think he just made it out of thin air. It was probably sitting in the recesses of his mind because he had gone through some soul-crushing training like this. And that's where he came up with the 6 feet figure.
With this hantavirus just coming into the news in mid-May 2026, I think all of what we discussed is worthwhile keeping in mind. Certainly not to dismiss out of hand any talk of a virus or another pandemic, but at least to be aware of what happened just a few short years ago. And actually today, May 13th, a CIA Special Operations Officer named James Erdman testified before the Senate Homeland Security Committee, alleging that Anthony Fauci improperly inserted himself into intelligence community analyses of COVID's origins to steer conclusions toward natural origin and away from the lab leak theory. And it really is astounding from beginning to end how many lies there were during COVID. From the very beginning, the origins of the virus, it was the official narrative, capital N, and the official follow the science narrative was that the virus originated from a wet market. And in fact, it was often portrayed as racist to describe the virus as originating in a lab, which interestingly I thought was a bizarre framing, because saying the virus originated from a wet market seemed more racist than that it originated in a lab, because the implication that if it came from a wet market is that these savage, weird Chinamen are eating penguins and so careless as to be unsanitary and just buying weird animals at a market, versus they're really sophisticated, technologically advanced, and they just made a mistake or this virus got out of their control. Like that seems less racist. But that's beside the point. The point is what actually happened. What's the truth? And all along, from the beginning, the preponderance of the evidence pointed towards it originating from a lab. And that is directly for what Anthony Fauci tried to suppress and what this whistleblower is alleging. And this is not a new story. This is just further evidence of what, in my mind, is clear, that Anthony Fauci was directly implicated in gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China, and probably in other places, and that obviously he had a vested interest in portraying the virus as originating from a bat and transmitting to humans via a wet market in Wuhan, rather than at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yes, indeed. It almost seems like to Fauci, the truth was merely incidental, and he had other, as members of the managerial elite so often do, he had other concerns that were far more pressing than what the truth actually is or was. And while we here cast aspersions at him from the land of the plebs, it is hard to deny that his wealth and fame and notoriety have increased massively over the last, say, 10 years.
Well, I haven't done any research on public polling among Anthony Fauci's reputation, but I would feel pretty confident that his favorability has taken a nosedive since probably I would guess the height of his popularity was 2020, 2021. And so, yes, he is wealthy. He was actually, I believe, the highest paid federal employee. He was making more than the president before he retired. But if he cares about his reputation, I think it has taken a hit. And so in that sense, perhaps he has paid a price in a more abstract sense, certainly not in any material sense.
I don't think that is the case. I think the court historians will largely look at Fauci favorably. And of course, had the COVIDian nightmare never occurred, virtually no one would know his name. There would be no knowledge of him. He would go down in history not at all. He would just be another faceless, nameless bureaucrat. Jeff mentions that Fauci did have something to do with the AIDS crisis in the 80s, where he was probably running a scheme not too dissimilar in a lot of ways from what COVID ended up being. Looking at Google Ngrams, which is a measure of the entire published library of American English books, the percentage of those books that mention Anthony Fauci, and in the 80s and into the early 90s, and compared to 2022, which is as far as Ngram's book viewer goes, the mentions of Anthony Fauci were about 1/10 of what they were in 2022. So he increased his notoriety and his fame by an order of magnitude. And that cuts off at 2022. Jeff's holding in his hands a book written by Anthony Fauci, an autobiography entitled On Call, that was written in 2024. So I suspect that number just skyrockets from 2020 up to 2022, and it shows no sign of abating. So I would assume in the subsequent year or two or three or four after COVID that mentions of Anthony Fauci continued to grow. So maybe his fame, if we try to measure it quantitatively, from COVID is 20x what it was during AIDS. But the point is taken that he, at least not in all footnotes about the medical field or the history of medicine, he wouldn't have been totally nameless, but he is going to be a much larger and more significant figure now than he would have ended up being if the COVIDian nightmare had never occurred. And the point still stands that he is not going to suffer in any meaningful way. Whatever having lower popular approval means exactly, it probably doesn't mean as much as the tens of millions of dollars and name recognition he'll be able to leave his descendants with. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.